The small brass key slipped from the pocket of my husband's suit, clattering sharply against the marble floor. That sound, in the dead silence of the funeral, echoed like a crack of thunder in the still autumn air. I startled. In that instant, all the prayers, sobs, and even the chill seeping through my thick coat seemed to vanish. The world around me froze, leaving only me and that tiny object lying on the ground. I bent down and picked it up with trembling fingers. It was an old key, its head etched with characters so worn they might once have been initials, but I couldn't read them clearly. Yet the shaft of the key gleamed from years of being handled. It carried a mystery, a feeling I couldn't name, as if it didn't belong to me, nor even to this solemn farewell. I quickly slipped it into my coat pocket and looked around. Everyone was still focused on the coffin. No one had noticed my small movement. My children sat in the front row, eyes red, while the priest continued his steady prayers. In that heavy atmosphere, no one noticed a key had fallen. Only I knew that from this moment on, I was holding something of Ernest's, something he had never spoken of. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. Today I stand at the funeral of my husband, Ernest, the man who walked with me through more than half a century of life. I still remember our first meeting, his shy glance under the eaves of the village church, and the warm smile when he took my hand at our simple wedding. And now, before me lies only his motionless body, dressed in the dark suit he loved most. Inside the church, dim light filtered through stained glass windows, casting the whole space in a mournful purple hue. The steady rhythm of prayers mingled with the wind slipping through the cracks, sometimes sounding like the sighs of fate. Thick incense blended with the scent of white chrysanthemums, making the air almost solid. I stood close to the coffin, placing my hand on the polished wood, feeling the chill seep into my palm. I leaned forward to straighten his lapel, a tiny habit, but one I'd kept our whole life together. Every time he prepared to go to work or step outside, I would do this, and he would always smile and say, "You always notice the little details." But today, as my hands brushed the cold fabric, there was no smile in return, only silence. And in that moment, the key fell out, shattering the familiar rules of a life I thought I understood. A tremor rose inside me, hard to describe. Why had he carried this key? What did it open? A door? A chest? Some room I'd never known? After more than half a century together, I had believed there was nothing left to hide between us. Yet the key in my hand now stood as proof of the opposite. The priest's voice still echoed, "May the Lord receive the soul of Ernest." I clasped my hands, but no prayer formed in my mind. Only questions spun deeper and deeper. Had he hidden a secret from me? And if so, what secret had he taken with him to his final moment? As the burial began, each handful of earth dropped onto the coffin with a dull, heavy thud. I watched, my hand gripping the key inside my pocket. The cold metal pressed into my palm like a reminder that from today on, my life would no longer be as serene as before. One by one, relatives stepped forward, placed flowers, and whispered their farewells. I stood there, motionless, watching every gesture. To them, today was merely the day they said goodbye to someone they loved. But to me, it was more. It was the beginning of a journey whose destination I couldn't yet see. When it was all over, everyone quietly left the cemetery. I walked slowly toward the gate, feeling the autumn wind sting my cheeks. The sun was setting, casting long orange-gold light across the cold gravestones. Inside my coat pocket, the key felt heavy, like an invisible weight pulling me down into an abyss of doubt. I told no one about it. Not my children, not my friends. This was the one thing belonging only to Ernest and me, or rather, to a part of Ernest I had never known. And even now, when I look back, I still shudder remembering that moment. I never imagined that this key would change the rest of my life. As I sat alone in the silent house after the funeral, I let the memories flood back. Everything began more than half a century ago, when I was still a young woman of 19 or 20, full of dreams and little experience. I first met Ernest at the spring fair in the small town where I was born and raised. He wasn't the sort of man who drew immediate attention. Not loud, not dashing like the other young men in town, but his eyes, a warm, deep brown, had a way of cutting through the crowd and stopping where I stood, as though I were the only thing he could see. At the time, I was helping my mother sell pastries at our tiny booth. He came up, said little, simply asked the price, then bought 3 pastries at once. But what I remember most is that when he handed me the money, he gave a small smile and said, "You have the hands that make the sweetest thing I've ever tasted." I blushed so hard I dropped the coins I was holding, and from that moment my life took a different turn. We loved each other, simply. No roses, no expensive gifts. Our dates were usually just walks along the riverbank or sitting under the old oak tree, sharing our dreams with each other. Ernest at that time was only a junior accountant at the general store, while I worked at the town's dressmaker's shop. But we both believed that as long as we had each other, we could overcome any hardship. We were married in a modest ceremony at the local church. I wore a dress I had sewn myself, and Ernest wore an old suit that had been passed down from his father. The guests were few, just family, close friends, and the church bells ringing that evening. It wasn't luxurious, but I had never seen a moment more beautiful. In the first years of our marriage, we lived in a small rented house on the edge of town. The roof leaked whenever it rained, the wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, and the winter wind slipped through the cracks, making us shiver together under a thin blanket. Yet I still remember the feeling of lying next to Ernest in the dark, hearing him whisper, "We'll be all right, Maggie. One day you'll have a warm kitchen, no more leaking roof." We truly didn't have much money. Meals were often just potatoes, some vegetables, and meat, but only occasionally. I patched the same clothes over and over, while he kept the books for a few local shopkeepers to earn extra money. But in return, that poor little house was always filled with laughter. When our first son was born, we could hardly afford a crib. Ernest built one himself from old wooden planks. It was crooked and squeaky, but I had never seen a gift so beautiful. On sleepless nights when the baby cried, Ernest would pace the room with the baby in his arms until it quieted. I would lie there in the dark, watching him, and feel a surge of absolute trust. This was the man who would protect me and our child for the rest of our lives. In the years that followed, we had a daughter as well. The tiny house grew even more cramped, but also fuller with children's laughter. I still remember the winter evenings when the whole family sat around the stove. Ernest would tell fairy tales in his warm, deep voice, while the 2 children fought for a place on his lap. I would sit nearby, mending clothes, glancing up at the 3 of them, my heart so warm it almost hurt. I believed that love, that trust, was everything. I trusted Ernest completely. Even when he came home late, even when his eyes sometimes seemed to drift somewhere else, I told myself, he's just busy with work. We weathered many hard years together. From nothing, we managed to buy a slightly better house and build a stable home for our children. I was always proud that we had done it, not through luck, but through love and unity. Those were the years I thought would stay with me forever as my most beautiful memories. But now, holding that mysterious key in my hand, I suddenly realized something. Perhaps while I was busy trusting and loving, there were gaps I never saw, and I began to wonder. Perhaps it was that very trust that made me blind to the truth. Our lives gradually became more stable after the years of hardship. The children grew up, attended high school, and then went to college. The little house Ernest had once promised finally became reality. A proper home, spacious enough for the whole family. I thought it was a well-earned reward for all those years of struggle. but it was precisely during that seemingly peaceful time that unusual silences began to appear. Tiny cracks I dared not pay attention to at first, but that later became fractures that could never be mended. Ernest suddenly had more business trips than before. His job had never really required much travel, and yet back then, every few weeks, he would pack a suitcase and say he'd be gone for a few days. At first, I didn't question it. I still clearly remember the first time he told me, "The company wants me to go to the next town to audit some records." I nodded, even packed his clothes for him, reminding him to take an extra coat because the nights there were cold. But over time, the trips became more frequent, and each time he returned, he seemed more withdrawn than before. At family dinners, while the children chattered about school, I would ask him about his day. But instead of joining in, Ernest would sit quietly, pick at a few bites of food, then set his chopsticks down. When I asked, "Is something wrong at work?" "You look so tired." He would frown slightly and answer curtly, "It's just work, don't worry." His silence wasn't the fleeting weariness of a long day. It felt like a wall was slowly being built between us. From the husband who used to share everything, Ernest became a man who held it all inside. And when I tried to break through that silence, he sometimes grew irritable. Once I said lightly, "You've been traveling so much, it must be exhausting. Maybe I could go with you." Before I could finish, he cut me off, his voice sharper than the gentle man I had once known. "Stay home and take care of the children. You don't understand my work. Coming along would only make things harder." The words pierced me like a small blade. I stayed quiet, bearing the hurt inside. Later, he looked at me, as if realizing he'd gone too far, but instead of apologizing, he simply sighed and retreated into his study. From that day on, I never dared suggest it again. Then, one summer evening, while I was folding laundry in the bedroom, the house phone rang. I hurried to pick it up, but before I could say a word, Ernest rushed out of his study, snatching the receiver from my hand. "Hello," he said, his voice low, strangely different. I froze, still holding the shirt I hadn't finished folding. On the other end, I caught a faint trace of a woman's voice. Before I could make sense of it, Ernest cut her off, his tone sharp. "Don't call this number again. I'll be in touch later." Then he slammed the phone down. In that moment, my heart pounded wildly. I opened my mouth to ask, but when I saw his eyes, both flustered and tinged with anger, I swallowed my words. He turned away and picked up the newspaper from the table as if nothing had happened. That entire evening, though I busied myself in the kitchen, my mind circled around that call. Who was that woman? Why would she call Ernest so late at night? And why had he been so desperate to stop me from answering? Those questions kept me awake all night. But the next morning, when I saw Ernest sitting calmly at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee as usual, I reassured myself, perhaps I was overthinking. Perhaps it had been a colleague or perhaps confidential work. I brushed it aside, telling myself not to dwell on it. Yet the image of him snatching the phone haunted me. Whenever I saw him sitting alone, his gaze far away, I would remember the sound of that faint female voice on the line. Time passed, and the children grew busier with school and friends. Outwardly, I kept our family warm and intact. Full dinners, a tidy home, children's laughter. But inside, a small corner of me had begun to fracture. There were nights when Ernest said he had urgent meetings, and I would sit alone in the living room, listening to the clock tick each second away. Every minute stretched into an hour. I asked myself, where is he really? What is he doing? And why is the distance between us growing larger and larger? Then I would chase the thoughts away, telling myself, Maggie, don't be suspicious. He's been by your side for so many years, has stood with you through so much hardship. How could there be deceit? So I continued to trust, or perhaps chose to trust, because sometimes trust is the only thing that keeps you from collapsing. But what I didn't know was that those unusual silences were only the beginning. The vague business trips, the heavy quiet, and that strange phone call, They were the first signs of a much greater secret, one I would only have the courage to face much later. Our lives gradually grew more stable after the years of hardship. The children grew up, went on to high school, then college. The little house Ernest had once promised became reality. A proper home, spacious enough for the whole family. I once thought it was the well-deserved reward for all those years of struggle. But it was during that seemingly peaceful time that unusual silences began to appear. Tiny cracks I dared not notice at first, but that later grew into fractures that could never be mended. Ernest suddenly had more business trips than before. His work had never required much travel, yet back then every few weeks he would pack a suitcase and say he'd be away for several days. At first, I didn't doubt him. I still remember clearly the first time he told me, "The company wants me to go to the next town to audit some records." I nodded, even packed his clothes for him, reminding him to bring an extra coat, because the nights there were cold. But gradually the trips became more frequent, and each time he returned, he seemed quieter than before. At family dinners, while the children chattered about school, I would ask him questions, but instead of joining in, Ernest would sit silently, eat a few bites, then quietly put his chopsticks down. When I asked, "Is something wrong at work?" "You look so tired," he would frown slightly and answer curtly, "It's just work, don't worry." His silence wasn't the passing weariness of a long day. It felt like a wall was slowly being built between us. From the husband who used to share everything, Ernest became a man who kept it all inside. And when I tried to break through that silence, he sometimes grew irritable. Once I casually mentioned, "You've been traveling so much, it must be exhausting. Maybe I could go with you." Before I could finish, he cut me off, his voice sharp, so unlike the gentle man I once knew. "Stay home and take care of the children. You don't understand my work. Coming along would only make things harder." The words pierced me like a small blade. I fell silent, hiding the hurt inside. Afterward, he looked at me, seeming to realize he had gone too far, but instead of apologizing, he only sighed and walked into his study. From that day on, I never dared suggest it again. Then one summer evening, while I was folding clothes in the bedroom, the house phone rang. I hurried to pick it up, but before I could say anything, Ernest rushed out of his study and snatched the receiver from my hand. "Hello," he answered, his voice lowered, unusually different. I froze, still holding the shirt I hadn't finished folding. From the other end of the line, I caught a faint trace of a woman's voice. Before I could make it out, Ernest cut her off, his tone hard. "Don't call this number again. I'll be in touch later." Then he slammed the phone down. At that moment, my heart raced. I opened my mouth to ask, but when I saw his eyes, flustered, with a hint of anger, I swallowed the words. He turned away, picked up the newspaper from the table as though nothing had happened. That entire evening, though I kept myself busy in the kitchen, my mind revolved around that phone call. Who was that woman? Why did she call Ernest so late at night? And why was he so desperate to stop me from answering? Those questions kept me awake all night. But the next morning, when I saw Ernest sitting calmly at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee as usual, I reassured myself, perhaps I was being paranoid. Perhaps it was just a colleague calling by mistake, or perhaps it was confidential business. I brushed it aside, telling myself not to think foolish thoughts. Yet the image of him snatching the phone clung to me. Every time I saw him sitting alone, his gaze far away, I remembered that faint female voice on the line. Time went by, the children grew, busy with school and friends. Outwardly, I kept the family warm and intact. Full dinners, a tidy home, the children's laughter. But inside me, a small corner had begun to crack. There were nights when Ernest said he had urgent meetings, and I sat alone in the living room listening to the clock tick each second away. Every minute stretched into an hour. I asked myself, where is he really? What is he doing? And why is the distance between us growing larger and larger? Then I would chase the thoughts away, telling myself, Maggie, don't be suspicious. He's been by your side for so many years, has stood with you through so much hardship. How could there be deception? So I continued to trust, or perhaps chose to trust, because sometimes trust is the only thing that keeps you from falling apart. But what I didn't know then was that these unusual silences were only the beginning. The vague business trips, the heavy quiet, and that strange phone call, they were the first signs of a far greater secret, one I would only have the courage to face much later. The brass key still lay quietly in the pocket of my coat, hanging in the corner of the closet. I didn't dare look at it for too long, nor touch it often, as if every time I did, my doubts would rise again. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I couldn't forget the metallic clink from that day, the sound lodged in my mind like a scratch that would never heal. Many times, I tried to find where the key might fit. I tested every drawer in the house, every kitchen cabinet, even the old jewelry box. But each time I slid it into a lock, it was loose, spinning uselessly. I tried the wooden chests under the bed, the bookcase drawers, even the toolbox in the garage. Nothing matched. Each time I let out a sigh, disappointed yet oddly relieved. Part of me wanted to uncover the truth, but another part feared what I might face. I began carrying the key in my coat pocket as though it were a strange talisman. At night, when the house fell silent, I would take it out and hold it under the weak, yellow lamplight. The worn-down markings on its head remained unreadable, but the longer I stared, the more it felt as if they were hiding a message. I wanted to believe it was just a keepsake, perhaps tied to some piece of Ernest's youth I had never known. But memories of his vague business trips, the strange phone calls, the look in his eyes when caught off guard, all of it made it impossible to keep lying to myself. One day, the chance came unexpectedly while I was cleaning the attic. Our attic had always been a storage space for old cardboard boxes, broken suitcases, and family odds and ends that were no longer in use. I climbed up on a winter morning when pale light filtered through the dust-coated window. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decaying fabric. I sneezed as I opened one box after another, searching for a few old toys to give the grandchildren. Pulling back a frayed tarp, I saw, in the dark corner, a small wooden chest. It was smaller than I expected, no bigger than a stool covered in dust and cobwebs. I bent down, wiped away the grime, and revealed a rusty iron lock on its front. My heart gave a jolt. I don't know why, but in that instant I knew I had to try the key. I hurried downstairs, dug it out from my coat pocket, and rushed back to the attic. Kneeling before the chest, I slid it into the lock. At first it caught, making my heart skip. But then, with a gentle turn, I heard a sharp, decisive click. The lock sprang open. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. But what was inside was not what I imagined. No gold, no important documents, no business papers, only a handful of faded photographs yellowed with age, a few torn letters, and a small notebook tied with an old ribbon. All stacked carelessly, as though they had been forgotten long ago. I sank to the floor, my hands shaking as I picked up the first photograph. In it was Ernest, much younger, perhaps in his early 50s, standing next to a woman I had never seen before. Her face was blurred, the light in the picture dim, but her smile was clear, a smile that made my heart tighten. I flipped through a few more. Some showed city landscapes I didn't recognize. Others were taken in cafes. In another photo, I spotted the same woman, this time with a young boy. The picture was faint, details indistinct, but the child's wide, dark eyes gleamed with curiosity. I picked up a torn letter. The paper had yellowed, the hurried handwriting slanted. Skimming the lines, I saw words like, "Thank you for sending the money," and "The boy misses his father." At the bottom, signed simply, "Anna." I froze. The attic seemed to shrink, the surrounding boxes closing in like walls. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my heart in my chest. Who was Anna? Was she the woman in the photographs? And the child? I wanted to keep reading, but my hands shook, my eyes blurred with tears. I placed everything back into the chest and slammed the lid shut, but deep down I knew I could never turn my back on it. Once the key had opened it, there was no pretending I hadn't seen. I sat numbly on the attic floor, still clutching the key. My mind was in chaos. Part of me wanted to run downstairs, confront my children, and demand answers from Ernest's acquaintances. But another part of me was terrified. Terrified of the answers. Terrified that all those years of trust and love might dissolve into nothing with a single confession. In the end, all I could do was sit there, my eyes fixed on the name on that letter. Anna. That name carved itself into my mind like a blade. It gave me no answers, only deepened the mystery. I held the key tightly, an overwhelming unease rising in me. I understood then, this was only the beginning. What I had discovered that day was just the tip of the iceberg. The truth beneath was surely deeper, darker. And I knew one thing for certain. From that moment on, I could never again be the complacent, trusting wife I once was. The key had unlocked not only an old wooden chest, but also an entire world of secrets Ernest had kept from me all his life. I couldn't shake the image of the name Anna from that old letter. For days, I forced myself to stay busy, cleaning, cooking, tending the garden, in an attempt to stop thinking about it. But the harder I tried, the clearer that name became in my mind, like ink spreading across a sheet of white paper. I knew I couldn't pretend. A part of me whispered that if Ernest had carried that key all the way to his grave, it must have been because he wanted the secret buried forever. But another part, louder, sharper, insisted, "You must know the truth. You must face it." At last, on a drizzly afternoon, I returned to the attic. The air up there was still heavy with the smell of dust and mildew. The wooden chest sat motionless in the corner, like some creature lying in wait, ready to be awakened. I dragged it out and brushed away the new layer of dust that had gathered in the past few days. The lock had already been unlatched. All I had to do was lift the lid. Inside, the photographs and letters remained, but this time I didn't stop at the surface. I carefully moved each layer of paper aside, digging deeper. At the bottom, beneath the yellowed scraps, I found a thick bundle of envelopes tied with a stretched rubber band. When I opened them, my heart froze. They were bank receipts. Each slip recorded regular transfers, month after month, year after year. The sender, Ernest Hayes; the recipient, Anna Whitmore. The sums weren't enormous enough to draw attention, but neither were they small. Each figure, each date, felt like a cold needle stabbing straight into my heart. I flipped through them quickly and saw the timeline stretch, nearly 20 years. For 20 years, Ernest had quietly been sending money to another woman. I sat stunned on the attic floor, the paper trembling in my hands. Beside the bundle of receipts, I found a small leather-bound notebook, its corners frayed. When I opened it, I immediately recognized the handwriting. It was Ernest's. The first pages were simple notations of daily expenses, car repairs, medicine. But as I turned further, the words became daggers. Transfer to A, the boy's tuition. A called said the hospital requires advance payment. The boy likes comic books. Buy more next trip. I read with trembling hands. The boy. There was no doubt left. Ernest had another child outside of our marriage. My throat closed up. The attic seemed to fall silent, leaving only the pounding of my heart. I shut the notebook, then opened it again, as though torn between denial and the need to face the truth. Ernest, why? All those years together, all the hardships endured side by side, I had never imagined the man I trusted most would hide a secret this enormous. I thought of the late nights he came home, the vague business trips, the interrupted phone call with a woman's voice. Suddenly, It all connected, forming a merciless picture. I sat there for a long time, tears dripping onto the pages, smearing the faded ink. And yet, amid the pain, another thought surfaced. If this were truly the case, why had he never abandoned me and our children? Why stay in this family? Why continue to provide, to care, to be a model husband at home? That question twisted inside me, leaving me unsure whether to be angry, disgusted, or pitying. I finally closed the notebook, returned everything to its place in the chest, locked it again, and slipped the key into my pocket. Then I sat motionless in the dim light of the attic. I knew that from this moment on, my heart would never know peace again. Every family meal, every morning cup of tea, every glance at the wedding photo on the wall, they would all carry a hidden fracture. But I also knew I couldn't reveal the truth yet. I couldn't simply throw this secret in front of my children, not while my own grief was still raw. I couldn't bear to see them doubt the father they had honored their whole lives. So I chose silence. I carried the weight in my heart like a hidden wound. I tucked the key away more carefully, no longer keeping it close. I buried the secret in the attic, where only the dust and shadows would share it with me. But silence couldn't erase suspicion. It only made it grow sharper in my mind. I began noticing things I had once ignored. The business trips, the bank withdrawals, the half-finished sentences when the phone rang. Each detail now became a shard of a larger, painful puzzle. Some nights, lying awake in the dark, I listened to the tick of the clock in the quiet house. Every second felt like a reminder. He betrayed you. He had another family. And yet, I whispered back to myself, maybe. Maybe he was only helping a struggling woman. Maybe the child wasn't his. Maybe. However, those weak excuses could never obscure the truth. Still, I clung to them. Because if I let them go, I feared I would collapse. That evening in the attic, I realized that my life had taken a different path. The key hadn't just opened an old wooden chest. It had unlocked the abyss of doubt inside my heart. And from that day forward, I lived as two women, the Margaret who smiled calmly before her children and grandchildren, and the Margaret who trembled in secret with the weight of what she had discovered. In the days after discovering Ernest's bank records and notebook, I could no longer find peace in the simplest of daily routines. Family meals with the children and grandchildren felt hollow. The laughter that once filled me with joy now only reminded me that I was playing a role, wearing a mask. I sat there, forcing a smile, while in my mind one name repeated itself endlessly: Anna Whitmore. At last, I could endure no more. I needed to see for myself, to know the truth instead of letting my imagination torment me. One gray April morning, I made my decision. I would go to the address Ernest had so carefully written in his notebook. The house stood on the outskirts of a small town, about an hour's drive from where I lived. It was an old 2-story brick house, the walls stained with moss, but the windows were clean, and pots of geraniums hung from the balcony. By the door, a bicycle leaned neatly, not a child's, but clearly belonging to a young man. I stood outside the gate for a long time, my heart thudding. At 72 years old, I never imagined I would live to see the day I had to knock on a stranger's door to learn about my husband's other family. But I drew a deep breath and pressed the bell. After a pause, the door opened. The woman from the photograph, Anna, appeared. She was in her 40s, with long brown hair and eyes shadowed from lack of sleep, but there was still a softness in her face. When our eyes met, I saw a flicker of recognition, quickly smothered by unease. "I'm sorry. Who are you looking for?" she asked cautiously. I spoke slowly, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'm Margaret Hayes, Ernest's wife." Her face paled. Her lips trembled, but almost at once she composed herself and shook her head. "I think you're mistaken. I don't know anyone named Ernest." I reached into my bag and pulled out one of the bank slips, holding it out toward her. "Then what about this name?" I asked. "And these payments sent to you for the past 20 years?" Anna glanced at the paper and stepped back. Just then, footsteps sounded from inside. A young man appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying a backpack slung over one shoulder. He wore a white shirt and jeans. When his eyes landed on me, he looked puzzled. But what pierced my heart was the look in his eyes, the same deep brown as Ernest's when he was young. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked. Anna turned away, avoiding my gaze. She tried to answer lightly. "It's nothing, son. Go back inside." But I couldn't tear my eyes from him. In that instant, every doubt solidified into undeniable truth. "That's enough, Anna," I said, my voice hoarse. "Please don't lie anymore." I know Ernest is his father." Anna clenched her fists, tears welling in her eyes. At last she nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, it's true. Ernest was Michael's father." The young man's name, Michael, struck me like a blow. I stared at him, stunned. He stood frozen, bewildered, then turned to his mother, searching for an explanation. "Father?" Michael whispered. "You mean he was really my father?" Anna broke down, weeping as she pulled her son into her arms, nodding. I stood there, feeling as though I were watching a play in which I was the uninvited intruder. Inside me, emotions clashed: shock, anger, humiliation, but above all, a choking grief. The man I had trusted my entire life had lived another life, a secret one, without me. "How long?" I asked, my throat raw. Anna wiped her tears and answered, "Since Michael was born, more than 20 years ago. Ernest never promised me much, but he always supported us, always checked in. He never forgot his son." I turned away, unable to look at them any longer. I felt pushed aside, reduced to a bystander in the story of my own life. I left that house in a haze, neither fully awake nor asleep. On the bus ride home, I leaned my head against the window, staring blankly at the trees rushing past. In my bag, the bank slip weighed heavily, pressing down on my heart. But I knew that to truly face this truth, I needed more than a tearful confession. I needed undeniable proof, so that when the time came to tell my children, there would be no uncertainty. In the days that followed, I quietly visited the bank branch, where Ernest had always done his transactions. With my gray hair and aged appearance, it wasn't hard for the staff to assume I was simply a widow sorting out her husband's finances. I asked gentle questions, probing little by little, until I got confirmation. For years, Ernest had regularly transferred money to Anna Whitmore, enough to raise a child with comfort and dignity. I didn't stop there. I sought out a few of Anna's neighbors. They told me Ernest would occasionally visit, bringing gifts for Michael, but never staying long. To them, he was just an old family acquaintance. Yet in their sympathetic glances, I knew they were aware of more than they said. Piece by piece, story by story, number by number, the picture came together. Ernest had another child, a young man in his 20s, carrying his blood. That night I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the bank receipts, the notebook, and the memory of Anna and Michael. The clock ticked dryly on the wall, each sound reminding me that time for hiding was running out. I was torn apart, hurt, furious, but above all, confused. What should I do? Tell my children at once, shattering the image of the father they revered, or stay silent, protecting their memory of him a little longer? I picked up the faded photograph from the chest, staring at Ernest's youthful face beside Anna. I remembered the years of hardship we survived, remembered his promise under our leaky roof. "We'll be all right, Maggie." My throat tightened. In the end, I chose silence, at least for now, because I didn't yet have the strength to destroy my children's faith, nor the courage to expose this fracture before the entire family. I whispered to myself, there will come a day when the truth must be spoken. But not today. I had tried to keep the secret to myself. I told myself I would remain silent a little longer to find the strength I needed. But the truth has its own way of slipping out, no matter how hard we try to bury it. And that day came sooner than I expected. That evening, the whole family gathered in the living room. My children, Charles and Eleanor, with their spouses and kids, were all together after Ernest's first memorial. I looked around the room, the warm glow of the lamps casting gentle light on their calm faces. None of them knew that I was hiding a storm inside me. I cleared my throat, my hands clasped tightly, my heart pounding. Children, I have something to tell you. All eyes turned toward me. The air grew heavy. Your father, I hesitated, had a secret I only recently discovered. Eleanor frowned. What secret, Mother? I drew a deep breath and said it plainly. Your father had another child. The room erupted as if thunder had crashed in the middle of a clear sky. Gasps filled the air, disbelief written on every face. Charles jumped to his feet. Mother, what are you saying? Father could never. Eleanor covered her mouth, her eyes wide, brimming with tears. My son-in-law sat frozen, while the children looked around in confusion, not understanding what was happening. I have proof, I continued, my voice trembling. Your father sent money regularly to a woman named Anna Whitmore. And their son, Michael, is now over 20 years old. No, impossible, Charles nearly shouted. Father wasn't that kind of man. I don't believe it. Eleanor shook her head again and again, tears rolling down her cheeks. I pulled from my handbag the stack of bank receipts and Ernest's notebook. Setting them on the table, I whispered, This is your father's handwriting. I wish I were wrong, but the truth is right here. The tension was suffocating. Charles flipped through the receipts, his eyes burning red. Eleanor lowered her head, her hands trembling. Just then, the doorbell rang. I opened it and received a sealed envelope from the mailman, the sender, National Bank. My chest tightened. I invited everyone to sit and tore it open. Inside was an official document, notice of a trust fund Ernest had established before his death. The beneficiary, Michael Whitmore. Eleanor broke into sobs. So that means everything Mother said, it true? Charles slammed his hand on the table. Father betrayed us. 20 years. He deceived this family for 20 years. Charles, I cried, tears spilling down my cheeks. Your father never abandoned us. He was here, taking care of this family. But at the same time, he had another responsibility. Another responsibility, Charles spat. That's called adultery, Mother. The room erupted in shouts. My daughter-in-law hurried the children out, leaving only the adults with their pain. And then, another knock at the door. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. Michael stood there, tall, youthful, a student's demeanor with the same deep brown eyes as Ernest. Beside him was Anna, her face anxious, her hand clutching her son's. I'm sorry, Anna said softly, but we can't stay silent anymore. Ernest left a will. We thought it was time to face it. Charles leapt up, shouting, Get out! You have no right to step into this house. Eleanor sobbed, Father, how could you? I stepped between them, arms outstretched. Stop, both of you! This isn't Michael's fault. He had no choice in who his parents were. Michael lowered his head, his voice choked. I just wanted to know who my father was. I never intended to take anything away from you. But if he left a trust in my name, I can't deny the blood that binds me. The room fell silent. I saw tears roll down Charles's cheeks, despite his efforts to hold them back. Eleanor turned her face away, unable to look at the young man standing there. I stepped into the center of the room, my voice trembling but resolute. My children, we must face the truth. Ernest was wrong. He betrayed my trust as well as yours, but that doesn't change the fact that Michael is flesh and blood. I won't accept it, Charles shouted. To me, Father had only 2 children, me and Eleanor. But you cannot change the truth, I said, my voice breaking. You can deny it, but blood does not lie. Eleanor's tear-streaked eyes turned to me. Mother, what are you going to do? I lifted my head and looked each of them in the eye. I will divide the inheritance according to the will, and I will acknowledge Michael as Ernest's son. The room exploded with emotion. Charles stormed out, slamming the door. Eleanor buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Anna wept silently, while Michael stood frozen, his shoulders shaking. I knew my decision would tear the family apart, but I also knew that if we chose lies or denial, the wound would never heal. I turned to Michael, my voice softening. Your father was wrong, but his mistake is not yours. From now on, you are welcome to come here. If you wish, you may call me Mother. Michael lifted his head, eyes red, whispering, Thank you. That night, when the house had finally fallen into silence, I sat alone at the table, surrounded by papers, the will, and the memory of my children's faces. The pain was still raw, but I knew the choice I had made, truth instead of lies. And in my heart, a question echoed, for myself and for anyone who might be listening. If one day the truth shattered your family, what would you choose? To deny it for the sake of false peace, or to face it and find a chance to heal? After that night of chaos, I knew my family would never be the same again. Charles stormed out in anger. Eleanor wept uncontrollably, while Anna and Michael left under the weight of silence. The house suddenly felt vast and empty, frightening in its hollowness. I sat alone in the living room staring at the wedding photo on the wall, my younger self beside Ernest on our wedding day, and felt my heart splintering. But when dawn came, I understood one thing. I had gone too far to turn back. The truth was out, and from then on, I could only choose to live with it. A few weeks later, I met with the lawyer and the bank. I signed the papers, confirming the inheritance would be divided equally among all 3 children, Charles, Eleanor, and Michael. That decision cut deep into the pride of my 2 biological children, but I knew I had no other choice. I refused to let Ernest's son grow up burdened with the shame of being the illegitimate child society cast aside. When the lawyer read the terms, Charles shot me a furious look. Mother, you betrayed us. You took the side of a stranger instead of your own children. I looked straight into his eyes, calm and steady. No, Charles. I took the side of the truth, and the truth is that Michael carries your father's blood. He turned away, silent. I knew the wound would take time to heal, but I would rather my children be angry at the truth than continue to live in the comfort of a long-held lie. At the court hearing, Michael stood up, his voice firm yet calm. I don't want this inheritance. I only wanted to know who my father was and to be seen as an ordinary human being. I don't need money. The room fell silent. I looked at the young man, and a surge of tenderness filled me. I understood the pride in his eyes, the pride of a child who had lived in the shadows for too long. But I still left his share untouched in the will, neither erased nor changed. My son, I said, my voice trembling but resolute, this is more than money. It is fairness. It is proof that you have a place in this family, whether you accept it or not. Michael bowed his head, tears falling. He whispered, Thank you, Mother. After everything, I left the big house that had held too many memories and too many tears. I moved to a small home in the suburbs with a wide garden and a low white fence. The house was simple, but for me, it was a new beginning. Michael often came by, sometimes bringing books from the university. I taught him how to tend the garden, how to grow roses and herbs. In the afternoons, we sat on the porch. I read aloud while he told me about his plans for the future. In his eyes, I saw traces of earnest, but also something new, something brighter. Sincerity, the yearning to be seen, to be loved. Sometimes I would sit alone in the garden, listening to the birds and smelling the damp earth after a rain, and I would ask myself, if I had known the truth sooner, would I have chosen differently? But then I smiled. No matter what, I had refused to let the secret stay buried forever. I chose to face it, and that was the only way to live honestly with myself. In the months that followed, the tension in the family slowly softened. Charles was still distant at first, avoiding Michael, but one afternoon he found Michael helping me repair the porch and carry heavy pots of soil. Charles stood watching for a long time, then quietly stepped forward to help. No apology, no explanation, but in his eyes I saw the cracks forming in his wall of pride. Eleanor, too, began to change. One evening, she saw Michael sitting in the garden reading to the younger children. He smiled gently as he patiently helped them solve a math problem. Eleanor stood there, tears slipping silently down her face. That night, she came to me and whispered, "Mother, maybe Michael, his family too." I held her hand and only smiled. No more words were needed. I knew, in time, my children would come to understand. And they did. Slowly, Michael was no longer the illegitimate son. He became an integral part of our meals, our laughter, and our family stories. Though Ernest was gone and the wounds he left behind remained, we chose a way forward together, to choose truth, to choose forgiveness, to choose kinship. I had learned one thing. We cannot choose the truth. The truth exists whether we want to accept it or not. But we can choose how to live with it, either deny it and let it eat away at us in silence, or face it and learn to weave it into the fabric of our lives. Ernest had died carrying his secret, but I, the one left behind, was left to bear the consequences. I no longer felt bitterness. Instead, I saw it as the final trial God placed on my shoulders to teach me forgiveness, to accept the fractures that could never be mended, and still find a way to keep living. As I write this story, I realize I am old. I do not have many years left, but I want to leave behind this message for anyone listening. Have you ever uncovered a secret that changed your life? If so, what would you choose? To live in a lie for the comfort of false peace, or to face the truth, no matter how painful, in order to find healing? I chose the truth. And that is why I can sit here today and tell you this story with peace in my heart.